So, our world can be so much better than it is today. But this depends on our choices. Not so long ago, in the 20th century, 300 million people died of smallpox, this horrific disease. 300 million people. It's more than all the people that died in all the wars and conflicts combined in the last century. Today, 0 people die of smallpox. 0. No one dies of smallpox. There's an amazing story behind this, and it illustrates 2 very important points. 1, that progress is possible. Problems, horrific problems, can be solved. And 2, it's in our hands. We have the choice. We can influence this. Because smallpox didn't eradicate itself. It was people like us, researchers, politicians, health workers, doctors, who did this together under the coordination of the World Health Organization at the end of the last century. And there's many problems like smallpox. If we attack them strategically and smartly, we can solve them. We can solve problems like extreme poverty, climate change, or the suffering of animals in factory farms. But only it requires us to take the effort to prioritize and to use sound reasoning. And that's why I'm so grateful to be with all of you here today, to do exactly that, to make these reasoning, to attack these problems in the most effective way possible, to do this as soon as possible and as well as possible. Welcome to the launch of Effectief Altruism Netherlands. Thank you.
The lovely Sjir.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you before you escape from the stage, what is your biggest wish for today?
My biggest wish for today is that we have a very inspiring day, but also a day that really starts something that is effective in itself. So it's not only a party to kind of celebrate this new movement, or you should really live by these principles and make sure that we all walk out here today with something that we learned, something that we can put into practice. That's what I wish for today, that we all get this out of today.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely.
Yeah, again. Not enough claps in the world for these 2 young guys. The lovely Sjir and Remmelt, where is he? Yeah, here, who was introduced to me as a big friendly giant. There he is. Which is, and those 2 guys have gotten all of you here together actually today to celebrate the launch. And not only them 2, but a whole team of people who you will see flying by today. And I will be flowing with you through this day. My name is Lynn. I am a go-getter. They called me on my little thingy. I like that, a go-getter. I am a social entrepreneur. I have a very experimental company called Dr. Monk, where we are always on a quest for impact and impactful concepts, but where we never really seem to be able to commit and stick to something because we feel we have the weight of the world on our shoulders and we want to save everything. So I hope to learn today as well, like how to make choices and how to actually get stuff done and have an impact. So really excited to be here today as well. I have a confession to make. I just had a baby and I have this milk brain going on. So I have a whole stack of papers that will be my brain for today. So you're in good hands of the little papers. Yeah, maybe it's good to kind of test the waters here and see who we are. So we know that we're like a bunch of givers in the room and influencers and just people who want to do good, people who have a good heart for the world and want to translate that into action. And there's many flavors of effective altruist, actually. So let's see a bit, like who does what or who tries what so far. Are you awake? First of all? Sure? I'm not really sure. Maybe, wait, before we start this, can you all rise? Because it's Sunday morning. I am normally in my bed at this hour. You as well, probably. Let's do a little alarm clock for ourselves. All right, so what we do is this. It's a very simple trick. We do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with our hand, and then our other hand, and then our foot. If you don't have heels, it's easier. And then your other foot, and then with 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1. And then we end like this. All right? Sounds very complicated. It's very easy. Okay. So here we go. So, and we are trying to wake ourselves up. So loud, please. Yeah? Okay. So 1, 2, 3. No, wait, guys. Sunday morning style. Okay, again. I want to hear you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now I trust that we're awake. Okay, so effective altruists. Who here, you can stand if you are this, what I say. Who here, we know that meat consumption contributes a lot to climate change and animal welfare, non-welfare. Who here in the room refrains from eating animals? Who's a vegan? A vegan. All right, okay, vegan is too much, I hear. Who's a vegetarian? Please also rise and stay standing. All right. Pretty good score. Pretty good, sir. Please stay standing. You can stay. Who here in the room gives 10% of their time to doing good? And doing good as in, I learned that from Kellie, doing something that's not for you or for your loved ones, but really for others in the world, important issues, other people who have nothing much to do with your personal life. 10% of your time. More than 10%. How much is that, actually? How much time do we have? How much is 10% of your time?
Well, if it's your career time, it's 10%.
4 hours a week. 4 hours a week. All right. Then who here gives 10% of or more of their money away to doing good? Please stay standing, everyone. All right, you just want to... Yeah. Okay. Who here chose a career specifically because they thought it was the most effective thing to do for the world? Okay. Who has not stood yet here? Who has not yet stood up? You have not yet. Can I have the hand mic? All right. Mister, I saw you. Is this on? Rens, is it working? You have not stood yet, you said? Oh, you have?
I have it.
Okay, great. So what do you do? How do you feel you're making a difference?
I am one of the founders of Moza Meat, which is a company that wants to turn tissue engineering into a technology that it can replace meat.
All right. So yeah, fantastic. So you actually chose a career that's exactly spot. Oh, you didn't choose it. Oh, you just rolled into it. Okay. All right. I get it. All right. Thanks. Anyone else who has not stood yet? Oh man. Although in the back, I have high heels on, man. But here I am. Okay. Tell us, why did you not stand yet?
Because I'm an egoist and
Alright.
I support Ayn Rand, and I guess that's why they invited me, because they wanted someone to go against this strain of thinking, I'm guessing.
Nice disruption. That's very useful. The power of the no. All right. Are there people who stood for everything? Holland's next effective altruist in the room? Who stood for everything? You get a book as a prize. You do. Who stood for everything? No one? Even Kellie? Sjir, you get a prize. All right. Well, that means we all have something to learn. That's good. It's time to introduce something who has only spent like 40 years thinking this stuff through, I think. And we were going to ask to compress it into like 40 minutes of introducing us to the thinking and the principles of effective altruism, which is very useful. And it's an invitation also to all of us to already start thinking about what you can do with it, of course. He's a professor in bioethics at Princeton, and he thought about so many things. It must be amazing to have people do something with what you have in your head, isn't it? Yeah, amazing. Let me not take this time away from Peter Singer. Yeah.
Good. And is my mic on?
Yes, your mic should be working.
Very
Yes.
good. Great. Okay. Well, I'm really delighted to be here with you at the launch of Effective Altruism Netherlands, because it's terrific that the Effective Altruism movement is spreading around the world. I have to say this is not the first launch of a national Effective Altruism group that I've attended, so it's nice to see more. And indeed, the Netherlands seems a perfect place for it. I've been here many times before, and I've always thought that people have very strong ethical commitments and a strong commitment to helping others, making the world a better place. So why not Effective Altruism Netherlands? It's kind of obvious. What I'm going to do is to just say a little bit. Some of you, of course, will already know quite a lot about effective altruism, but for those who don't, I'm going to give an introduction to some of the basic ideas and some of the people in the movement, and raise a few questions about that. And then I think we're going to have some time for discussion and questions afterwards. Okay, so let me move on with that. No, we've already heard about that. Right, here we go. Effective altruism is changing our ideas about what it is to live an ethical life. What I mean by that is that conventionally you can live an ethical life without doing a great deal of good for other people. You simply have to not do certain things, not harm others, not cheat or lie or steal, a variety of those rules, moral rules that you're probably familiar with. And that might have made sense in earlier times when what you could do was at least limited to those within your particular group. But we're living in a different world today in which some of us are extraordinarily privileged, essentially people living in developed, affluent nations, at least those who are at the middle class level in those nations. Of course, we accept there are some people still in poverty, but people who are middle class or above, people who think nothing, for example, for spending €3 on a cup of coffee or something like that, you are exceptionally privileged compared to another, let's say, 7 to 800 million people who live in extreme poverty by the standards of the World Bank. And I would argue that we need to change our ideas of living ethically to take account of that fact, to take account of some of the things that we can do, we in the affluent section of the world can do in order to make a big difference to the lives of people who are in poverty without really sacrificing anything important. In fact, arguably without sacrificing anything at all when we think about our self-interest in an enlightened kind of way. Okay, so let's just look at firstly what is effective altruism. As you can see here, it's both a philosophy in that popular sense of thinking about your life, setting goals for your life, deciding what standards or values you will live by, and a social movement, an emerging social movement, less than 10 years old still. Nobody had, in fact, the very term effective altruism had not been coined 10 years ago, and a lot of the thinking and information research that has gone into what effective altruism is today had also not started 10 years ago. But so what it is firstly the idea that altruism ought to be a significant part of our lives. Thinking about how to make the world a better place ought to be one of our major life goals. And secondly, insofar as we act in accordance with that goal, that is, insofar as we put our time or our money, our resources into trying to make the world a better place, we should not do that impulsively or just based on emotional responses to particular appeals we might have, but we should combine the head and the heart. We should draw on our ability to reason and our ability to assess evidence in order to find the most effective ways to improve the world. And that's something important that is a significant change in how philanthropy has been prior to effective altruism. And I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. Okay, now I've talked about improving the world, but you might ask, what do we mean by improving the world? There are value questions there, obviously. To say you're improving the world implies some particular values. Well, I can't tell you what values all effective altruists hold because there is no particular creed. This is not a religion that everybody who joins has to subscribe to certain creeds or articles of faith. Instead, it's a movement, loose movement of diverse groups that decide for themselves and individuals who may not belong to any groups but consider themselves effective altruists. So all I can say here is some of the characteristic values, the values that I think most effective altruists do hold as important. So firstly, when they talk about improving the world, they really do mean improving the world. They don't just mean improving things in their own community. So in that sense, effective altruists are cosmopolitans or global humanitarians. They're concerned about the world as a whole. Then if you say, well, what aspects of the world are they concerned about? You might get a wide variety of answers, but I think there's a common core, a core that really all effective altruists would agree values that are important. And then some of them might say, that's all, they're the only values that I think of as important. And others might say, well, they're important, but they're not the only things that are important. There are these other values that are important. But when we get to the other values, we would start to have less agreement. But that's fine. We don't have to all agree on things. It's good that we agree on a common core. So that common core, as I say here, is that suffering is a bad thing. If we can reduce the amount of suffering, the amount of pain and misery and distress in the world, we are making the world a better place. And premature death is a bad thing. If we can reduce the number of children who die before their 5th birthday, for example, that's a measure that UNICEF keeps, the number of children each year who die before reaching their 5th birthday. And most of those deaths are related to poverty, extreme poverty, and not being able to have safe drinking water or enough and the right kind of food, or not being able to get health care. So if we can reduce those deaths, that's a good thing. And fortunately, we are making progress. Those deaths have been coming down pretty steadily. Even in the less than 10 years that the effective altruism movement has been going. They've dropped from around 10 million a year to around 6 million a year. That's pretty good progress, but of course, there's a long way to go. And the deaths of young teenagers and young adults, all of those things. If we can reduce that, that's a good thing. Then the third value on which I think effective altruists agree is that animal suffering does matter. So Lynn referred to factory farming, or Sjir referred to factory farming as one of the things that we can stop. So the suffering of animals in factory farms, I haven't met any effective altruists who think that that's completely irrelevant, just doesn't matter at all, that we should only be concerned about the suffering of members of our own species. But it is true that effective altruists vary in the priority they give to that, perhaps because they have different views about how you compare the suffering of non-human animals with human suffering. And that is a difficult question, so I'm not surprised that there might be differing views. So those are three characteristic values, as I say, not necessarily the only ones. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about some of the people in the effective altruism movement and the choices that they have made in terms of how to live ethically and why they reached those choices. I'll start with Toby Ord, who has some claim to be regarded as the founder of modern effective altruism. Toby was a graduate student at Oxford University about 10 years ago, and he was thinking about many different things, but one of the things that he was thinking about was about what he ought to be doing to improve the world. He'd read an article that I wrote many years ago called Famine, Affluence and Morality, and that was one of the things that triggered his thinking, but I'm sure there were other influences as well. And one day, being somewhat mathematically inclined, Toby decided to try and work out how much good he could do through donating to a charity, to an organization that was helping people. And he did the calculation this way. He was, as I said, a graduate student at the time, so he was living on a scholarship. Not a lot of money. I think it was around £14,000 at the time. You know, the pound is worth a little bit more than the euro, so, well, now it's only worth a little bit. Maybe then it was worth a bit more before they all had that stupid vote a while ago. You know, maybe that was, I don't know, 18,000 euros or something. It was not a lot to live on for a year, but Toby felt that it was enough, that he was living perfectly comfortably on that amount and didn't really need more. And so he then thought, well, what am I going to earn in future if my career goes according to plan? So he was a successful graduate student in philosophy at Oxford. He had a reasonable expectation that he would be able to become an academic, get paid as academics are, not an enormous amount of money, but quite a reasonable amount of money that gradually grows as you go through the levels and become a full professor. So he did a little calculation of what he might expect to earn through the rest of his career until retirement at well, late 60s or whenever it was that he was expecting to retire. And then, so add all of that up, deduct from it your living costs each year, which was his graduate studentship. You'd adjust it for inflation, of course. This is all in you know, standard non-inflated amounts. So you deduct that amount and you're left with a large sum of money, right? And then the next step is to find a really effective charity that is doing something good for people at low cost. So what Toby came across after looking around for a bit was organizations that were preventing and treating trachoma. Trachoma is the leading cause of preventable blindness in the world. It's generally not a problem in places like here, but it's a problem in countries where there's poverty, where there's poor hygiene, and particularly where there's a kind of hot and dusty environment. Because then there's a microorganism that can get in your eyes, and very, very slowly it causes your lashes to turn inwards and to scar your cornea, and over maybe 15 or 20 years, with hardly noticing it, your vision becomes more and more blurred, and eventually maybe you get this as a child, but eventually you become blind. In fact, I think the next slide shows children being treated for it in North Africa. So if you can treat children at this age to prevent this to kill this microorganism so they don't get it, or you can sometimes treat it later on. But it's very inexpensive to do this. Toby's calculations, in fact, were that you could prevent a case of blindness for about $25. That was a figure he got from a medical journal. So on that basis, dividing that $25 into the amount of money that he had, he calculated that over his lifetime he could prevent 80,000 people becoming blind. And he was amazed by that figure. And when you think about it, that is a pretty amazing figure, that one person, without, being a hero, without having to sort of put their life in danger or anything like that, and not a particularly wealthy person, just on an academic salaries, could prevent 80,000 people. Just think of it as, a big football final stadium full of people. All of them owe their sight to the fact that you've donated to an organisation. So Toby was impressed by that figure and decided that more people should know about it, and so he set up an organisation called Giving What We Can, in which he publicised that and called for more research on which organisations are or are not highly effective, and he himself announced that he would take a pledge to live on the inflation-adjusted scholarship figure. I think maybe he added just a small amount to it, added a couple of £1,000 a year to it, just for a little bit of extra comfort, but pledged to live on that. He didn't ask others to take such a strong pledge. The website of Giving What We Can urges people to pledge to give 10% of their income, which was the amount that Lynn asked you to stand up if you were giving. So that's a figure that's been around now in the Effective Altruism movement. So that's Toby's contribution, which, as I say, came out of a philosophy background and a strong personal commitment. But not everybody in Effective Altruism has thought about things quite as explicitly as that. Here's Julia Wise, who's an American who now does work for the Center for Effective Altruism, but she formed these ideas basically as a child, as she tells the story. And she has this really good blog called Giving Gladly, so you can see there, givinggladly.com, which talks about, in quite a personal way, about choices she makes as an effective altruist. And she explains that even as a child, once she learnt that there were some people who did not have enough food to eat, some children who did not have enough food to eat, whenever her mother bought her a treat of some sort, she thought, oh, well, this is very nice, but wouldn't it have been better perhaps to give that money to somebody else who doesn't even have enough food to eat? And here am I getting an ice cream or whatever it is that I like, but I don't really need. And when she got a bit older, she decided to do something about that. And so she started committing, she was also not wealthy, she was a social worker, she qualified as a social worker. She also started committing some of her income to give away. And then she fell in love with a guy called Jeff Kaufman, and persuaded him that if he wanted to live with her, he was going to have to do the same kind of thing. And fortunately, his love was strong enough to make that commitment. And even more fortunately, he was a computer programmer who then got a job with Google. So now they have rather more money, and they're now giving away about half of their income to effective charities. And the third person I'll mention is someone rather different, and this is going to lead me on to a different way of living effectively. This is Matt Wager. Americans call him Matt Wage, but as you're Dutch, and that's a name of Dutch origin, I understand, you'll know how to pronounce it properly. So Matt was a student of mine at Princeton, a philosophy student, and he was a very good student. In fact, he got the philosophy department's prize for the best final year essay that the students do. So he was headed, you could say, for a career somewhat like mine, or Toby's, as an academic, where he was received offers of places in excellent graduate schools, including Oxford University, where I went. But he had been thinking about questions of, what would really be a career that would do the most good. And he decided that the world had enough philosophy professors, and perhaps it does. I don't know. It's hard to say. But he decided that, although it would be interesting, he could probably do more good in a different way. And because, as well as philosophy, he also had a strong math background, we have a kind of recruiting fair at Princeton where various corporations from Wall Street and from the finance industry, as well as computing startups and so on, come to Princeton to recruit best undergraduates and offer them pretty high salaries even from their starting year. So Matt was offered a place at a Wall Street firm and decided to take it, not because he thought that what he would be doing would be super ethical and help the world a great deal there. He thought, in fact, it would be more or less neutral, and we can talk about that later, but because he would then be able to give away a lot of money and would actually be able to do more good than Toby Ord could do, because he would be earning a lot more money than academics earn. So he did this. It was about 5 or 6 years ago. Already in his first year working for this company, he was able to give $100,000 to Effectief charities. And he's continued to give at least half of his income every year since. So it was about 5 years ago. His income's been rising, so he's been giving substantial amounts each year. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about this idea of what makes might make an ethical career. And if you're interested in this, if you are at the age where you're still making career choices, and looks like some of you may be, and some of you, like me, have made that choice a very long time ago. And by the way, I didn't stand up to say that I chose my career on an ethical basis, because when I went into philosophy, I was just interested in philosophy and the questions that were raised. Later, I found that by doing ethics, I think I could do things to improve the world. But if you're making that choice, I recommend this website, 80,000 hours, 80,000 being a rough estimate of the number of hours that people spend in their career. And what's interesting about that is that people spend those hours in their career, but how many hours do people spend actually thinking, and seriously thinking, not just casually thinking or chatting with friends, but seriously thinking and maybe doing some research into what career would actually do the most good? And many people don't think about that at all. Even if they go to a career counsellor, the career counsellor will talk to them about, well, what's your passions? What are your interests? You should follow your passions. But this is a useful thing to think about. And as Matt's choice shows, the answer may not be obvious, because most people, if you said, well, I want to follow an ethical career, they would say, go and work for an NGO, go and work for a charity, go and work for Oxfam, or go and work for an environmental organisation, or go and work for someone that's helping the homeless in the streets. Very few people would say, maybe you can do more good by earning a lot and giving it away. But the reasoning behind the idea that you can do, or you may be able to, this is not for everybody, you have to have certain skills and a certain character. The reasoning behind the idea that you may be able to do more good is like this. Suppose that Matt had applied for a job at an NGO, let's say Oxfam, right? They were advertising for some new staff. He had applied and he had got the job, and in that job he'd been organising Oxfam's programs to help people in poverty in various ways. How much good would he have done by applying for that job, getting it and working in it? Well, you can't say that the difference he would have made is everything that he actually did at Oxfam, because there are other people applying for that job as well. It's an attractive option for people to work for Effectief for charities. So the difference that he would have made would have been how much better he could do the job, assuming that Oxfam selected him, and assuming that they were right in thinking he was the best applicant. But the difference would have only been how much more good he could do as the best applicant as compared to the second best applicant, who would have been appointed if he hadn't been in the field at all, right? So there's a difference, but it's not a huge difference, most likely. Now consider what Oxfam could do. Let's just assume that he gave the whole of that 100,000 I mentioned to Oxfam. That's more than they would be paying for that job. In fact, at least in terms of starting salaries, probably they could hire 2 people for $100,000. So what you're comparing is, on the one hand, 2 completely new positions that Oxfam could fill, with the difference that between what the best applicant and the second best applicant makes for a position that Oxfam has been able to fund already. And that's the thinking that suggests that donating, earning for good, can, if you can do it, if you have the character to stick at it and you have the skills to earn a lot of money, can actually be a very effective thing to do. But of course there are other things that are very effective, and if you go on this website, it's not just telling people to go and work in the finance industry. It's telling people to think about a whole range of different things, to maybe do research in areas where we can make breakthroughs. Sjir talked about the smallpox breakthrough. What other breakthroughs can we make which will help people to overcome diseases, or to feed themselves better, or to combat climate change? We do need bright people to go into research. We may need people to go into politics and try to change politics for the better. Difficult task, but not one that we can afford to abandon. And we may need some people with particular skills to work for NGOs and non-profits, who will be very good at that and will not necessarily have the skills to do some of these other things. So there's a whole range of ethical careers that's worth thinking about, and there's a lot of information on that website. Now, I've been talking about global poverty as my example of what effective altruists might be doing, and giving you Oxfam as an example, but I don't want to give the impression that effective altruism is only about global poverty. It isn't, but I do think that's one among a relatively small number of effective causes to give to. I think it's important to think about where your philanthropy is going. If you have resources to give, I think it's really important to think about them. And as I said, effective altruism is changing that thinking. A lot of people think that there's no way of making that choice, as no objective criteria for making that choice, that it's just a matter of what your interests are. Again, sort of follow your passion. I think that that's a mistake. So here I've got one example of where you could put your philanthropy. This is the Philharmonic Hall at the Lincoln Center in New York. If some of you are keen on music and you've been to New York, perhaps you've been there. You might have gone to this hall. It used to be called Avery Fisher Hall, and it seemed to me it was a perfectly good venue for listening to a concert. But the Lincoln Center decided that it needed renovation, so they launched an appeal for $500 million to renovate that building. And they received an initial donation of $100 million from David Geffen. He's the mogul behind various entertainment ventures, including DreamWorks. You've probably seen the DreamWorks logo on movies. And it's now going to be called David Geffen Hall. So that's one way in which you could use your resources, if you have lots of them, to donate. Then I've already mentioned you could donate to, let's go back. I've already mentioned you could donate to curing trachoma. Here's another popular cause in the United States. It's a foundation called Make-A-Wish. This is a foundation which helps sick or dying children. So it has a very strong emotional appeal, right? You talk about children who are dying from cancer, perhaps. You want to help them. But of course, you may not really be able to help them live because the condition may be incurable. If it were not, then generally they would be being treated. So what you can do is you can help them, you can grant their wish, what they would like to do for a day. So one of these granted wishes that got a lot of publicity a while ago was this boy who wanted to be Bat Kid, okay, part of the Batman sort of movie and saga. He wanted to be dressed up as Bat Kid and drive around in the Batmobile, which is a big car with big fins, with Batman, you know, sitting next to him, and rescue someone from this evil person called the Riddler. So the Make-A-Wish Foundation did this, got lots of publicity because the whole city of San Francisco, where it was, got involved in it. And everybody thought, oh, isn't this wonderful? What a great foundation, it's doing all this good. But if you ask how much did it cost, the foundation won't exactly tell you. But they do say that on average, it costs $7,500 to grant a kid's wish. This one might have cost a bit more. Well, for $7,500 given to an effective charity, you could probably save the life of at least a couple of kids. And if you compare giving one kid a great day, which is a nice thing to do in itself, but compare that with saving the life of a child, I'm sure that that kid, and certainly that kid's parents, would have much rather had their life saved, the child's life saved, than just one good day. So it seems pretty obvious that this is not really an effective charity, even though it appeals strongly to our emotions. So I think we need to think about these things and find the charities that do the best job. And here's one of them, just for example. If you want to save the lives of children rather than give them a good day, then giving them bed nets to protect them against malaria-carrying mosquitoes is a very cost-effective way of doing that. It's been proven to save children's lives, proven by the same rigorous standard that we use to test new drugs, randomized controlled trials of distributing the bed nets in some villages and not others, and you can see the impact it makes on the death rate. So I think that we do need to think about the right causes, the right organizations to donate to, and ones that are doing what exactly they're doing. Now, just very quickly, because I don't want to go too much over time, how do you assess effectiveness? Well, there are organizations now that have just, again, within this last 10 years, have started to do really rigorous research on the impact of charities and balance that against their costs, so that you can roughly work out which are the organizations that will make your dollar go further. And here's an American organization that's doing that, called GiveWell, which looks at charities in depth and recommends a small number. So if you go to the website, givewell.org, and you click on top charities, you'll find their top charities. Some of them are international, and some of them are American. You may have something similar that people will talk about in the Netherlands. But it's that kind of research that we need to do. And as I say, fortunately, people have started donating to GiveWell and similar organizations to enable them to build up the research staff to make recommendations. And that's a really good investment, because for every dollar that's donated to an organization like that, you may get $8 or $10 that flow to organizations that are far more effective than those dollars would have gone to otherwise. And something similar is now existing for animal suffering, if you're interested in contributing to reduce animal suffering. Again, this is an American organization, Animal Charity Evaluators, and they don't have as much staff as GiveWell, so their recommendations are perhaps not researched in quite the same depth, but I think they are useful. And I should mention that both of these organizations actually have an impact on their field, because previously charities simply had to hand out glossy brochures with pictures of smiling kids, and people would donate to them, because nobody could really even ask the question, well, yes, but what will I get for my dollar if I donate to you as compared to if I donate to that charity? But now that people can go to these websites and see which are the most effective, charities have to produce some data if they want to be part of receiving the benefits of the money that flows through effective altruism groups. So it's actually making the organizations themselves more conscious of the need to document document the impact that they're having and demonstrate their effectiveness. And here's just the last of these organizations I'll mention, in which I have some interest since I wrote a book called The Life You Can Save and set up a website, and then various people said you could do more with this website than you're doing, and it really now has spun off into a fully fledged organization called The Life You Can Save. And it also recommends organizations, effective organizations to donate to, as well as trying to bring more people into this way of thinking. Okay, I'm getting near the end, but I want to say one thing about motivation. Why do people become effective altruists? What is it that leads them to do it? There's no one answer to that. Different people have their different motivation. But I want to close by mentioning somebody who was a good friend of mine. He died nearly 20 years ago now, and was a pioneering strategist in the animal movement, perhaps the most effective strategist in the United States animal movement, at least for the last quarter of the 20th century. His name is Henry Sjir. He was actually born in Belgium, and then is of Jewish origin. His parents left Europe and immigrated to initially to Panama, and then managed to get into the United States. So Henry really worked all his life for the oppressed and the downtrodden. He marched in the civil rights movement in the South in the late 50s and 60s. He worked as a merchant seaman and tried to reform the corrupt National Maritime Union, which was doing sweetheart deals with the bosses and cheating the sailors out of a decent wage. He went to Cuba after the revolution to check for first-hand on what was happening there. And then in the 70s, he started to realize, he actually came across something that I wrote, and he started to think that maybe the most downtrodden, the most oppressed of all are non-human animals, because they don't even really get a voice in the decisions. And so he started working to stop cruelty to animals, and probably he, more than anyone else, was responsible for getting the cosmetics industry, largely, not 100%, but largely, to stop testing its products in painful ways on animals. Now, I'd always said to Henry that I wanted to write something about his strategies and how he was so effective, how he was so good at getting big corporations to change their policies. But I never got around to doing this until one day he phoned me up. I was back in Australia by then. I'd known him in the United States. He lived in New York. I'd seen him from time to time, but I was back in Australia. And he said, do you still want to write that book about the strategies I've used and try to help others to use similar strategies? And I said, sure, I'd still like to do it. I don't know when though. And he said, well, it would be good if you came and did it soon. I said, why? He said, because the doctors have told me I've got cancer and it can't be treated, and I've probably only got a few months to live. So I went over there and we did a lot of interviews, which we recorded, all about his campaigns and his strategies. But I also wanted to talk to him about his philosophy of life, to use that term. And especially I was impressed with the fact that here was someone who was dying, but didn't seem at all really depressed by that. So I talked to him directly about that, and he said he felt he wasn't really troubled by dying. He was 71 or something, I think, at the time, so he could have expected certainly to live longer. But he said he wasn't really distressed by dying because he felt that he'd used his life well, and that was a satisfying feeling. And this is a particular quote that came out of the interview. He said, I guess basically one wants to feel that one's life has amounted to more than just consuming garbage, consuming products and generating garbage. Sorry, I should have said. Not exactly consuming garbage. I'll have to read more carefully next. One likes to look back and think that one's done the best one can to make this a better place for others. And adding, he wasn't doing this out of a sense of duty. It wasn't like a burden that he had to do it. It was what he wanted to do. And when he felt he was doing it well, that was when he felt best, when he was drawing on his talents and abilities to do good for others. And I think that's a phenomenon that I've noticed talking to people in the animal movement and in the effective altruism movement. And it's something really that some of the ancient Greek philosophers talked about as well. If you are thinking about your own well-being, your own fulfillment, your own satisfaction, you're not likely to get it by saying, okay, everything that I'm going to do is directed towards my happiness. I'm going to earn money so that I can go and lie on a beach in the sun or travel here or there. Yeah, you can certainly get some pleasure out of doing those things. But if you really want to feel that some fulfillment and satisfaction in the way you're living, that you've been challenged, but you've met those challenges, then I think setting yourself a goal that is worthwhile in itself, like trying to contribute to reducing the amount of suffering in the world, and working for that to the best of your ability, is one of the best lives that it's possible for a human being to have. Thank you very much.
Wow, I'm very nervous. Oh. And I am, because first of all, you prefer to hear him talk probably than for me to ask him questions. That's first. So I'm like in this spot, taking away you telling us more about your experiences, your life and your view in the world. And it kind of feels like my son meeting Freek Vonk, which is not funny for you. It's Steve Irwin, maybe. The Dutch Steve Irwin, Freek Vonk. And he's 6 and he's sitting there, zet hem op, Freek Vonk. And Freek Vonk, this guy is a biologist, and he tries to teach our children to be nice to animals and to the planet. And I was explaining to him this morning that I am leaving on a Sunday morning to work, but it's not really work, it's like meeting my Freek Vonk, someone who has inspired you to spend your life in a certain way. And now I'm allowed to ask my Freek Vonk a few questions, and I'm allowed to facilitate which questions come from the crowd. And I'd like to start actually with a question to the crowd, which is, you know, Peter gives these examples of people, and it seems very positive. Right? Sjir's on stage, a young ideologist. He's hungry to make a difference. Talked about Matt, even your friend, the last story of your friend. They're hungry. But when I sit here, I also feel a little bit of a heavy heart. So I'd like everyone to stand up. The world's not that pretty. Yet, right? The world's not that pretty yet. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So I also feel emotional, and I feel sad that we're making a mess in this world. And you take the positive point of view, but maybe you want to start by telling us how your heart feels actually when you talk about these things.
So of course, I'm deeply disturbed by the amount of unnecessary suffering that still exists in the world. Is my microphone still working? Yeah, sorry. Okay. So, when I started to realize, this was also when I was a student at Oxford in the early 70s, when I started to realize the amount of suffering we inflict on animals, and did the research for my book Animal Liberation, which involved, really sitting every day for months in libraries looking at accounts of animal suffering, often accounts not written deliberately to describe animal suffering, but the accounts of experimenters describing what they were doing to animals and realizing how much suffering that was, or the accounts of agricultural consultants and advisors telling farmers how many chickens they could cram into one of those little wire cages that fortunately are no longer legal in the European Union, but were absolutely standard then. That really upset me greatly. But I think what kept me going, and why I didn't just say I can't do this anymore and go out in the sunshine, was the idea that I might be able to make a difference for it. And that, if you have that, if you stood up because you have this heavy heart, I really think that the heavy heart, if combined with a sense of complete powerlessness, is very depressing. How could it not be? But heavy heart, if you think about you can work with others to make a difference here, to make change, then that helps to lighten the heavy heart. And I think that that is possible. And I think that that's what the effective altruism movement is all about.
Yeah, so we're going to practice that together today. Who can share this feeling, right? Who has already arrived there a little bit? So yes, there is a heavy heart. And when you see the world for what it is, it's an emotional thing, right? It's not pretty. But we do have the power to make choices and to make a change. Who's already there? Can you stand up if you feel optimistic as well? So you can have both, right? Optimism. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So the Dutch newspaper Trouw wrote a piece about your new book, a review. And the journalist ended the review by saying, "What could be a bigger achievement as a moral philosopher than to have a movement to be created on the basis of your moral philosophy?" Do you feel proud?
Well, I do feel proud to have had an influence on it. I think the journalist was somewhat overstating it. It's not entirely based on my philosophy. I think my philosophy is one element that has contributed to it. But I do want to say, because people sometimes get a little confused, my particular ethical philosophy is utilitarianism. That is the view that we ought to act so as to produce the best consequences. Best consequences meaning something like happiness and the reduction of suffering. But not everybody in effective altruism is a utilitarian. You could hold views that there are some things that are just always wrong, no matter what their consequences, as a Kantian, for example, might hold. And you could still think that as long as I don't have to do one of those few things that is always wrong, like kill an innocent being, apart from that, I'll try to do the most good I can. Unfortunately, you don't really have to go around killing innocent human beings to do good. We don't live in quite such a bad world. So I do want to make that clear that you don't have to subscribe to everything in my philosophical views in order to join effective altruism. It's a broader movement than that.
Well, I do feel proud, I must say, and I think everyone in the room feels proud. And I also wonder, do you sometimes feel impatient?
Yes, I certainly feel impatient. People often ask me, say specifically about the animal movement. It's now 42 years since animal liberation appeared. And they say, what do you think about the changes? Do you feel proud that you've contributed to these changes that, as I said, have got rid of those really small wire cages for laying hens and the individual stalls for breeding sows and for veal calves, which existed when I wrote the book? Well, of course I'm pleased that we got rid of them, but there's still, there's still factory farming. There's still animals confined indoors all day. The cages might be a little bit larger, and that's good. The sows may be able to turn around, and that's good. But we're still not treating animals as they ought to be treated. So I am impatient about progress there, and I'm also impatient about progress in reducing extreme poverty. We could be doing a lot more about that. As I said, the number of children dying before their 5th birthday has fallen, but it's around 6 million per year at the moment, which when you break it down on a daily basis is 17,000 a day. That's far too many. It's far too many. We could do much better than that if we really just put a little bit more effort into it.
Yeah. So your example of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, it illustrates that actually the human mind, that's so easily triggered by emotions of things that could happen to us as well, or things that feel very urgent, that we identify with, right, that play into our emotions, that actually our human brain is not very helpful to become an effective altruist. What's your view on that?
I think that that's true, that most people are more strongly motivated by an emotional pull than by rational thought, analysis, weighing of evidence, and so on. But we're complex beings, and we have the ability to change that. We have the ability to think about things and to curb our emotional attitudes, or to some extent, and bring more of the reasoning into it. So I think we have to continue to work on that. And people do think, generally people do think about getting value for their money. This is one of the paradoxes of the way philanthropy is. If somebody wants to buy a new laptop, for example, right, they're not just going to walk into a store, most people not, and say, oh, that one's a pretty color, I'll have that one. They're going to say, well, what does it do, and how much do I have to pay for it, and could I get another one that would do exactly the same for less money? So it's rather strange that when it comes to philanthropy, people are so almost exclusively, most people, influenced by their emotions, and not by saying, well, what are you actually going to do with the donation, and how do I know what good it will do?
It's strange, but then we're trying to understand that as well. And as an effective altruist, we look at the evidence. So I've just been involved in a giving experiment, and we have two people tell a story of why they give. And the one tells the emotional story, emotional motivation, and the other one tells the effective altruist story. Mm-hmm. And then we ask a crowd of people, who of these two givers is the most moral one? And most people pick the emotional motivated giver. Uh-huh. Right? Yeah. So there's something, like we have this feeling, and I've actually been called a rational bitch before, or cold-hearted, right? Cold-hearted, because of using the head. And I don't know exactly what's going on, but we feel kind of, because even when I hear you speak and I think about, what it would be like to have you as a father or have you as a friend, right? You would be on the moral high ground all the time. You would annoy me, right? It would be hard to live next to you. So it's not nice. It's not nice to hear someone who is so perfectly rational and is really acting upon their moral values, because it confronts you with everything that you don't do.
It is confronting to people, I think, and that's also a problem. Lynn asked people whether they were vegan or vegetarian or whatever. That's confronting for people who are not too, because they sort of don't want to think that maybe they're actually doing something wrong in the way they're eating. So it is a problem about how you can address people in a way that is welcoming and inclusive rather than threatening and therefore off-putting. I agree, and we have to get better at that. But it's interesting that you were doing this research, because I've also been involved with psychologists in trying to do research about how best to approach people. And this is a growing area, and I'm hopeful that we will find out over the next few years how best to approach people, so that to draw them in to the way of thinking that leads them to doing the most good.
Yes, perfect answer, because it's a bridge to my next question. And my next question is actually a dilemma, and I want you guys to engage. So what do we prefer? A world where, on the basis of the knowledge we have now, effective altruists say that we live in a more moral way, so where people are vegan, where we donate more to effective charities, where we think strategically about our careers, but we just nudge them into it, right? They're all just going to do it, but we kind of play to have their psychology to be in favor of these actions? Or do we prefer a world where we actually teach people the principles of effective altruism, actually kind of getting them in touch with their own moral views, which they probably already have, and just help them to live in accordance with their own moral views? So the one is we just trick people, and the other one is we teach people, we empower people with this way of thinking. So who's for option A? We're just going to trick the world into it. Get it done. Yeah, get up, get up.
Yeah, quite a few.
Tricking. Thank you. You can sit down. Is there anyone who doesn't want any of these options? Because can I assume the rest is B? No, not the rest is B. We have an alternative.
Yeah.
It depends. What's your take on it?
I was going to say something like that, right? I was going to ask you another question, right? So suppose that in the world in which we trick people, we get twice as much money donated to effective charities as the one in which we try to teach them, at least over the next decade or whatever it might be that we're doing this. Because I think then I will go for the trickery or the nudging, let's put it more kindly. But if other things are equal, sure, I will go for the teaching, and you might think that in the long run the teaching will be more effective because people will understand better. Whereas if they're in some way tricked into it, then they won't stay with it. So that's another factor. You have to try to balance those things out.
Yeah, so I kind of put it as a funny game, right? But there is this question of, is everyone able to go through this journey of, explore what your moral actually is, step one, right? Get the tools, have access to the knowledge, to the evidence, prioritize, make the choice, and act. Like, do we trust? Because to me, it seems so obvious when you're telling the story. You're like, how come the world is not organized in this way? Why don't we teach kids to think like this in primary school? What is wrong with us, right? It makes so much sense. But then I do somewhere wonder if everyone is capable of being an effective altruist.
Well, one other thing that needs to be taken into account is that there's lots of evidence that many people are pretty conformist. So essentially they will follow the crowd. Humans are not as different from sheep as we sometimes like to think. So if it may be that we can change people simply by getting enough people to start thinking this way about it. And then it will spread. And it won't be really that we're tricking people, we'll just be showing them by example what we're doing. And I think this is important, and it's one of the reasons that I've always emphasized that we should actually be talking about our charity and our philanthropy and how we're doing it. A lot of people don't like to do that. They think it's boasting, immodest, or they'll cite Jesus, who said you should, not do your alms in front of men because then you already have your reward. But if you do it secretly, then God sees you and will reward you. Well, I think that that's actually the wrong way to do it, because I do think it's really important that we influence others. And if others see what we're doing and know what we're doing and we talk about it, they're much more likely to do the same.
That makes me reconsider my own donation behavior, because maybe investing in Effective Altruism in the Netherlands is creating such a movement, right? You do the start, and then we can just have other people to herd, right, with us to make a real difference. To join in anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm in between the questions the crowd wants to ask you with my very last question. So think about it, right? What your question is. You get the opportunity to ask a question. And you said in the beginning, it used to be very simple, or we used to think it was very simple to be moral. You just don't do any harm. Have you done any harm in the past week? Because it doesn't seem so simple to me.
Well, of course, in the past week, I've, for example, flown quite a bit because I was in Australia before I came to Europe. I think it's just over a week. Maybe if I strictly take a week now, I could escape that. But yes, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in flying, and I do fly. You can offset them, but I'm not really convinced that offsetting truly is the same as not emitting them in the first place. So certainly, I've contributed to climate change, which is one of the greatest harms that we're doing to the planet, to the people in it, and to future generations. And I have done.
Is that the only example?
Well, maybe it's the only one I'm going to tell you about.
Okay, great. Let's do a question from the audience. Who has a question? Yes. I'm going to hold the microphone because I'm afraid you're going to have a very long question and then I can pull it. I can just pull on it so it's finished.
Great. Hi. Great. I'll be short then. So I was thinking about the story you said about Matt. Well, he's going to make money from the investment industry and he's going to then give it away to charity. Are you worried about how is he going to make those money and where does money come from? And do you basically find ways to integrate effective altruism in the work of the people that are actually donating to charity?
Okay, so yes, I am interested in the question of where the money comes from and whether he's doing harm by doing it. And I have specifically asked him that. I saw him last a couple of years ago, so I don't see him regularly. His firm shifted him to Hong Kong, so he's no longer near New York or Princeton, that area. So that's why I haven't seen him that much. But what he's been doing, the firm he works for is essentially trading in commodities or buying options to buy or sell commodities. And the specific work that he's doing is trying to write algorithms that predict the movement in prices of these commodities. So if if his algorithms predict that the commodity will rise, his firm, of course, buys it or buys a buy option, and if vice versa, if it's falling. Now, it's not a huge firm. It's not buying on such a scale that, when the price will rise, it buys up so much that the price zooms up and people can't afford it. It's, not really a perceptible difference on the level of the quantities of these commodities that are being sold. So his view is that it doesn't really have any significant impact on anyone except, that it provides, if he's successful, it provides returns, profits for the investors. And he would argue, in fact, that maybe by, let's say, you predict the price is going to rise, so you buy in now, so the price rises a little bit now, rather than remaining flat now and then jumping more abruptly later. So he thinks that there's even an argument that it makes the curve smoother and causes less disruption in the market of these products. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to me really that it's doing any harm. I think, as I said, I think it could well be neutral. Now, there certainly would be other positions in the finance industry that would be doing harm. For example, if you were trying to raise capital so that a company could open a big new coal mine, then I think that would be doing serious harm. And I would think that if you were working for such a company and you were asked to do that, you should go and talk to the bosses and say, this is not something I'm willing to do, and I don't think it's a good thing for our company to be doing. And there's a small chance that you might persuade the bosses to change their mind, and that would be great if you did. And if not, maybe you need to leave and become a whistleblower on what the company is doing and why it's a bad thing, and the fact that you've been on the inside may give you more credibility. So I think it's okay for people to go into these areas, as long as they go into it while keeping their conscience alive and not simply getting sucked into the as long as it's good for the firm, then it's good for the world kind of thinking, which obviously is not always true.
Great. So there were two questions hiding in your question one. The first one is, do you think about the way you earn the money and the effect of that way on the world? And the second one, is there also an option to go into producing or being part of our capitalistic system and trying to influence that for the better? And is that also a real option? Yeah. So your question answered. I'm going here. Victor.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to the Netherlands. We enjoyed it very much. I'm wondering that on a certain fundamental level, there's a question of, do we want to change institutions from within or create new ones? And over the past few weeks, I've talked with various people who've been in various high positions, and they're all saying it's very hard. It's all very path dependent. And maybe, for example, if we want to do education for primary school kids and change that, maybe it's more effective to change completely new paths or organizations that do that. What's your view in this? I think it will depend on exactly what kind of institutions you're talking about and what you want to change. But I mean, some people, I'm not really quite sure on what scale you're thinking, but I do sometimes get asked the question which says, look, the kinds of things that I've talked about, for example, the Against Malaria Foundation distributing the bed nets, they'll say that does nothing to reduce poverty as such. It just reduces some of the symptoms. So it's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound, and it's not stopping the wound. But then the question is what the other options are. And some people go to the whole scale and say, we have to change the global economic order, which usually is kind of language for saying we have to get rid of capitalism. And essentially, firstly, I have no idea how you would do that. I have no idea in the present world of a strategy that would lead to that. And secondly, if you ask people, well, what would you put in place? You don't usually get a clear answer which would reliably meet human needs better than capitalism does. I mean, I admit that capitalism is flawed and doesn't meet all human needs perfectly, but it does create quite high levels of productivity. And some of the other systems proposed have not created such productivity. So those are the two problems with trying to change at that level. But then you could, be at more at a middle level. So I have a friend and fellow philosopher at King's College London called Leif Wenaar, who recently wrote a book called Blood Oil about essentially what's sometimes called the resource curse.
the fact that I think actually that term may have come from the Dutch experience, right, with North Sea oil or something like that. So it's the idea that if a large part of your economy is geared to selling resources, you end up being worse off. But Renard takes it a step further because with countries that have more corrupt governments than the Netherlands, it gets much worse. It becomes, a lot of the profits flow to the dictator of that country. They pay their militia, they maintain their dictatorship with more oppression, or maybe someone else can see how much money they could get if they could stage a coup and throw out the dictator and become dictator in their place. So, there's also more civil war. So what he's suggesting is that we try to get companies, corporations and standards about not buying resources from countries where it's clear that the resources are not benefiting the people of the country as a whole, but only the government. So that's a more limited reform, and I think it would be a very useful reform that would contribute to the reduction of global poverty if you could do it. And I certainly, support those efforts, and I think if you think that there's a chance that will succeed, then an effective altruist could donate to something like that, to publicise that, to try to start such a movement, and that might be a reasonable gamble, although it's difficult to estimate the chances of success. So, in some ways I think you can try to change institutions, but sometimes you just have to do the best you can within them.
Interesting. So it's not just about what is most effective, but it's also your kind of risk preference or ambiguity preference, right? Is that what you're saying? So we can all have our own position in that. The Malaria Foundation is not the charity to give to. It depends on how certain you want to be that your euro has an impact, right?
Exactly, that's right.
And then maybe we go into this difficult thing of wicked systems and very wicked solutions to those wicked systems, and we're less sure.
Yeah, and that's right. And the chance you might, of course, put a lot of money and time into that, and it doesn't succeed or never succeeds during your lifetime. So then you feel you've wasted it. But if there was a chance that it would succeed and that the payoff would be big enough, then maybe it was worth taking that chance.
Interesting. Gert, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, well, it's maybe related to this. In the example you gave between the bad kid and the trachoma treatment, it's very clear, and then...
It sounded like a bad kid, but it's the bat kid, right? Like the Batman kid.
Exactly, yeah, or the orchestra. But then this question arises, okay, where does it get blurry? Because there might be an even better intervention than the blind kids. Like, for instance, put existential risk or climate change in the mix, and then try to weigh off which the priority or which intervention has best impact then. And my question is not so much which is the best, but are we effective enough in evaluating this to actually already start investing in interventions specifically, or should we actually spend all our time and money in evaluating different interventions? How secure do you feel about our ability to judge effectiveness now?
Okay, I think it's difficult. If you're comparing really different causes, and so you mentioned existential risk. Let me say a little bit about what that is, because maybe not everyone is familiar with that term. Existential risk is the risk of extinction of intelligent life on this planet, and there are various ways in which that could happen. Obviously, one that's pretty easy to grasp is there is a small risk that a large body like an asteroid or comet could collide with our planet with such force that it causes the extinction of life on the planet. So that's one risk, quite small, but still it is a risk. And there are things we could do to reduce that risk, like track all the bodies that might collide with our planet. NASA is already trying to do that, and then start thinking about what you could do if you did discover one on course. Could you build a rocket that would crash into it, maybe set off an explosive device that would deflect it from its path a little bit? So by spending a certain amount of money, you could reduce a risk, which might be, say, over the next century, that might be 1 in a million or something like that, whatever. You could reduce it to 1 in 100 million, perhaps. Now, you might say, well, 1 in a million, 1 in 100 million, what's the difference? They're both very small. But when you're talking about the extinction of life, that's a huge catastrophe. And even reducing the risk a little bit is worth doing. And of course, there are other risks more difficult to assess, like a pandemic, either natural or through bioterrorism, that could wipe us out. Some effective altruists are concerned about the risk of artificial intelligence getting smarter than us and taking us over and deciding that we're superfluous, they don't need us, and wiping us out in that way. So, you know, depending how speculative you want to get and what your inclination to certain kinds of what you might think of as science fiction but may turn out to be science prediction is you may or may not be interested in these things. But it's difficult to compare because one of the things you have to take account is not just the fact that one of these events would cause the death of 7.5 billion people on the planet. That's clear, and that's something that you can discount by the chances against it and so on. But the fact that it would cause the extinction of human life or of intelligent life on this planet means there would be no more intelligent life in this corner of the universe, at least. Maybe there is somewhere else in the universe, but in this corner of the universe, there'd be no more intelligent life for the foreseeable future. Whereas if we do survive and we get a little bit clever at solving our problems over the next century or two, and perhaps we start to colonize other planets, then there could be intelligent life in this corner of the universe for millions or even billions of years, and for trillions or quadrillions or quintillions of beings living rich and fulfilling lives. But some people, when you say that, they say, well, you know, if there is this extinction event, those people will never exist. They'll never know what they were missing out on. So it doesn't really matter, right? And other people will say, oh, no, it's a huge tragedy because these lives will never be lived. And it would be good if these lives were lived. So your question really says, can we work out whether it is or is not a huge tragedy that lives will never come into existence if those lives would be good? And I'm not really confident when you say, you know, I guess you're suggesting, should we wait before deciding where to donate our resources until we've solved these problems? I'm not really sure when exactly we're going to solve these problems. And I think in the meantime, we would be missing opportunities to help people in extreme poverty, to reduce animal suffering. And those things seem to me things that are certainly good. So while I definitely believe that some effective altruists should be doing this research and thinking about these problems of which causes are the best, even causes very difficult to compare, I don't think that's a reason for saying we shouldn't be giving yet. I think we want to build the movement, get more people into the movement, and I think we can do that in our present state of knowledge without waiting for final answers to those questions.
Wonderful, thank you. It's dazzling though. Your answer is dazzling. So on the question of, you know, can we empower people to think in this way? When you hear Peter talk, you're like, wow, so many things to consider in your choices. I want to thank you. Thank you for being here, for sharing your thoughts. And I actually wanted to end by asking you, you know, we are proud of you, even if you're very humble about your influence on the movement. We're very proud and thankful. We are impatient together, but I also wanted to ask if you had a wish for us. So we're starting here officially with Effective Altruism Netherlands. Is there a wish you want to share with us?
I certainly wish that effective altruism will thrive in the Netherlands, that the Netherlands will become an example of people where it takes strong roots and where you live ethically. I think in various ways, actually, I think of the Netherlands as an ethical example. Obviously, tolerance is something that we've associated for centuries with the Netherlands and something that has been learned. I personally, I haven't talked about this, it's a bit different, but one of my interests in bioethics is about end-of-life decision-making. I see the Netherlands as a pioneer in more thoughtful and rational end-of-life decision-making that other countries are slowly starting to learn from. So I hope that the Netherlands will prove to be a pioneer in effective altruism and not only, equal what has been happening in the United Kingdom and in the United States and other countries, but will actually develop new ideas and new thoughts about how to involve more and more people. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Can we stand up for